He said, "Man, that sure is some good-looking stagecoach. That's what they call a motor, a bus, a motorhome."
Ernest Borgnine carried a secret about a co-star who made his life a living nightmare. For years, he stayed silent. But now, the truth comes out. Violent tempers, on-set sabotage, and a scalding coffee attack that left permanent scars. But what really shook him wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Borgnine was Hollywood's everyman, a powerhouse performer who could play heroes, villains, and everything in between. But behind the cameras, his career wasn't just built on talent. It was forged through brutal feuds, relentless challenges, and moments that nearly broke him. From Joan Crawford's ruthless mind games to Spencer Tracy's on-set mind tricks, from Shelley Winters' overpowering presence to a near-fatal helicopter crash, these weren't just obstacles. They were battles. And through it all, Borgnine never backed down. Today, we uncover the untold stories of Hollywood's toughest survivor. Ernest Borgnine's journey to Hollywood stardom wasn't paved with privilege or careful planning. He was born Ernest Borgnine in 1917, the son of Italian immigrants trying to carve out a life in America. But from the very beginning, his path was anything but stable. When he was just 2 years old, his parents split up. His mother took him to Italy, where he spent the next 5 years immersed in a world completely different from the one he was born into. He spoke only Italian, lived in a small town near Modena, and embraced a culture that felt more like home than the United States ever had. Then, without warning, everything changed again. His parents reconciled, and he was brought back to America. He had to learn English all over again, adjust to a new way of life, and figure out where he belonged. Growing up in New Haven, Connecticut, Borgnine wasn't the type of kid dreaming about Hollywood. He wasn't sneaking into theaters, memorizing movie lines, or practicing dramatic monologues in the mirror. He was an athlete, a kid who loved physical competition. His focus was on sports, not scripts. By the time he graduated from high school in 1935, he had no grand plans to be an actor. In fact, if it weren't for a twist of fate, he might never have stepped in front of a camera at all. That twist came in the form of the U.S. Navy. Fresh out of high school, with no clear direction for his future, Borgnine enlisted. It was supposed to be a short-term commitment, a way to gain discipline and see the world. But the Navy had other plans. He was stationed aboard the USS Lamberton, serving on a destroyer that took him across the Pacific. For 6 years, he lived the life of a sailor, learning the importance of camaraderie, endurance, and discipline. By 1941, he was ready to return to civilian life. He received an honorable discharge and thought his time in the service was over. Then, history intervened. 2 months later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was thrust into World War II, and Borgnine couldn't just stand by. He re-enlisted in early 1942, this time serving aboard the USS Sill, a patrol yacht assigned to protect the Atlantic coastline. War changed him. It hardened him. It gave him a sense of purpose. He spent the next 3 years on the water, rising to the rank of gunner's mate first class. By the time the war ended in 1945, he had spent a decade in the military. He was at a crossroads. Re-enlisting for another 10 years was a real possibility. The Navy had become his life, and if things had gone differently, Hollywood might never have known his name. But then, his mother said something that altered the course of his future. She told him he had a strong presence, a personality too big to go unnoticed. She suggested he try acting. It was an idea that had never once crossed his mind. But with no other plans and nothing to lose, he decided to give it a shot. The transition wasn't easy. Borgnine had no experience, no connections, and no idea where to start. But he wasn't afraid of hard work. He enrolled at the Randall School of Drama in Hartford, Connecticut, where he learned the basics of performance. Then, in search of real-world experience, he joined the Barter Theater in Virginia. It wasn't a glamorous start. The theater had been founded during the Great Depression on the idea that people could trade food for tickets. That meant the actors weren't paid in money. They were paid in whatever the audience could spare. One night, Borgnine's entire paycheck was a bag of vegetables. He took every role he could, whether it was a background character, a stagehand, or even scrubbing toilets when needed. Every moment was a lesson. One night, during a live performance, he had to chase a live chicken across the stage. The bird escaped into the audience, flapping wildly as people screamed and laughed. It was chaos, but instead of panicking, he rolled with it, turning the disaster into entertainment. That moment taught him one of the most important lessons of his career: how to improvise. His big break came when he landed a role in Tennessee Williams' The Glass Menagerie. He thought he was terrible, but the audience responded differently. The performance was a success, and for the first time, people in the industry started to take notice. By 1949, he had made it to Broadway. His debut came in Harvey, a long-running play starring Hollywood legend James Stewart. But getting there wasn't easy. Casting directors didn't know what to do with him. His face was too rough for romance, too expressive for villainy, and too unique to fit neatly into any category. But Harvey proved them wrong. He played a male nurse, a small but significant role, and he studied James Stewart's every move. He carried around a notebook, writing down everything he observed, analyzing the way Stewart delivered his lines, how he carried himself, how he commanded the audience's attention. Then came Hollywood. His first TV appearance was in Captain Video and his Video Rangers, a low-budget sci-fi series that paid next to nothing. But it got him noticed. Columbia Pictures offered him a small part in The Whistle at Eaton Falls in 1951, a role that barely made an impact but put him on the radar. Then, in 1953, everything changed. He was cast as Sergeant Fatso Judson in From Here to Eternity. It was a brutal, villainous role, and it required him to tap into a darkness he didn't know he had. His character was cruel and sadistic, a military officer who beat Frank Sinatra's character to death. The performance was so convincing that Sinatra refused to speak to him off-camera for weeks. Some audience members even sent him death threats, unable to separate the actor from the role. That film put him on the map, but it also threatened to typecast him as a villain. Then, in 1955, an opportunity came along that no one saw coming. He was cast in Marty, a quiet, low-budget film about a lonely butcher looking for love. The character was the complete opposite of everything Hollywood thought Borgnine could play. Director Delbert Mann originally wanted Rod Steiger, who had played the role in a television version. Borgnine wasn't even on the list. But after a chance meeting with the producers, he was given a screen test. His performance was so natural, so deeply human, that Mann later said, "Ernest Borgnine didn't act Marty. He was Marty." The film was a gamble. Made on a shoestring budget of $343,000, no one expected it to be a hit. But when it premiered, audiences connected with it in a way no one anticipated. The film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes. Then came the 1955 Academy Awards. Borgnine was up for Best Actor against Hollywood legends like James Dean and Spencer Tracy. No one expected him to win, but when the envelope was opened, his name was called. He was 38 years old, making him one of the oldest actors to win for a debut leading role. His acceptance speech was simple. He thanked his mother for encouraging him to pursue acting. But what most people didn't realize was just how close he had come to missing out on the role altogether. If not for a last-minute decision, his career might have gone in a completely different direction. Winning an Oscar was supposed to open every door in Hollywood. But instead, Borgnine found himself in a strange place. Studios still didn't know where to put him. He wasn't a traditional leading man, he wasn't a conventional character actor, and he refused to be pigeonholed. The real battle for his career was just beginning. Succeeding in Hollywood wasn't just about talent, it was about survival, and Ernest Borgnine knew that better than anyone. His time in the Navy had taught him discipline, but nothing could have prepared him for the battles he would face on set. Some of his greatest performances were forged in conflict, clashing with co-stars whose egos, tempers, and demands pushed him to his limits. One of the toughest challenges came in The Poseidon Adventure. Released in 1972, the disaster film followed a group of passengers fighting to survive after their ship capsized. Borgnine played a tough, no-nonsense detective, but behind the scenes, the real fight wasn't against the ocean. It was against Shelley Winters. Winters was already a two-time Oscar winner, and she carried herself like one. She wasn't just an actress, she was a force of nature. She challenged directors, rewrote lines, and pushed for changes, whether the script needed them or not. One day, she arrived on set with a 20-page document outlining her character's backstory. She insisted that the script be adjusted to reflect it. The director resisted. Borgnine watched from the sidelines, knowing that arguing with Winters was like arguing with a storm. It didn't matter if you were right, you were going to lose. Then came the infamous underwater scene. Winters was determined to do her own stunts. She wanted to prove she could still swim like a champion, despite being 51 years old. The sequence, which involved her character making a dangerous underwater swim, was originally meant to be filmed in just a few takes. Instead, it stretched into a grueling 14-hour day. The cast was exhausted. The crew was frustrated. And Borgnine? He was barely holding back his temper. It took 65 takes before the director was satisfied. Borgnine later admitted that working with Winters had been one of the most exhausting experiences of his career. But even he couldn't deny her talent. When the film was released, her performance was one of the most talked-about aspects of the movie. And despite all the tension on set, she walked away with an Academy Award nomination. But not all on-set rivalries ended with respect. In Bad Day at Black Rock, Borgnine found himself up against one of Hollywood's most intimidating actors, Spencer Tracy. Tracy was a legend, a two-time Oscar winner known for his effortless acting and unpredictable method. He didn't just perform, he controlled the scene, bending it to his will. Borgnine, still proving himself in Hollywood, was nervous from the start. Tracy's presence alone was enough to put pressure on him. But it wasn't just nerves. Tracy had a habit of improvising, throwing in lines that weren't in the script just to keep his co-stars off balance. Borgnine wasn't used to that. The tension came to a head during the diner fight scene. Tracy, playing a one-armed war veteran, had to take down Borgnine's character in a brutal brawl. It had to look convincing. No stunt doubles, just raw physical action. The first few takes were stiff. The punches didn't land right. The movements felt too choreographed. Tracy, getting frustrated, decided to turn up the intensity. Then it happened. Borgnine, caught in the heat of the moment, accidentally punched Tracy in the jaw. Hard. The entire set went silent. Borgnine froze, expecting an explosion of anger. But Tracy just stood there, massaged his jaw, and nodded. "That's better," he muttered. The fight scene was finally coming together, but it wasn't finished yet. The most difficult part involved Tracy flipping Borgnine onto a table using a single-arm judo throw. At first, Borgnine thought it was impossible. But after 14 takes, each one more physically demanding than the last, they finally got it right. Tracy had spent most of the shoot keeping Borgnine on edge, but after that fight scene, something changed. He saw Borgnine in a different light. And when it came time for Hollywood to cast Marty, it was Spencer Tracy who put in a word, recommending Borgnine for the role that would win him an Oscar. But no co-star tested Borgnine's patience more than Joan Crawford. Their feud didn't even start with him. It started with someone else entirely. It was the set of Johnny Guitar, 1954. Crawford wasn't just the star of the film, she was the queen of the production. She expected total control, and if anyone challenged her, she made them pay. And no one paid a heavier price than Mercedes McCambridge. Crawford and McCambridge were like fire and gasoline. McCambridge was a strong-willed actress, best known for her deep, commanding voice. But Crawford saw her as a threat, and she wasn't about to share the spotlight with anyone. So, she made her life hell. One morning, before filming, she stormed onto the set and grabbed McCambridge's costumes. Without warning, she dragged them outside and threw them onto the highway, leaving them to be destroyed by the passing cars. The crew scrambled to save what they could, but the message was clear. Crawford wanted McCambridge humiliated. The tension got so bad that the two actresses refused to be in the same room together. The director was forced to shoot their scenes separately, stitching them together later in editing. But Crawford's wrath wasn't just limited to McCambridge. One afternoon, after a particularly frustrating take, she snapped. A young production assistant had been sent to deliver a message to her trailer. When he knocked, she threw open the door, holding a cup of steaming hot coffee. Without warning, she flung the scalding liquid at him. The assistant was left with second-degree burns. The crew was horrified, but no one said a word. Borgnine, watching from the sidelines, was stunned. He had seen tempers flare on set before, but nothing like this. Years later, he called it the most unprofessional behavior I've ever seen. And then came the final showdown. As filming wrapped, Crawford cornered McCambridge and issued a final warning. She told her, in no uncertain terms, that she would destroy her career. And she almost did. After Johnny Guitar, McCambridge struggled to find work. Crawford had used her influence to make sure her name disappeared from casting lists. It was only years later, after voicing the demon in The Exorcist, that McCambridge managed to reclaim her place in Hollywood. Borgnine, looking back, would later say that working with Joan Crawford was like walking on eggshells while juggling dynamite. She was brilliant, she was legendary, but she was also dangerous. For Borgnine, these battles weren't just stories, they were lessons. Hollywood was full of larger-than-life personalities, and surviving meant knowing when to push back and when to step aside. And as much as these feuds tested him, they also shaped him. They forced him to be better, tougher, and more unshakable. Because in Hollywood, it wasn't just about delivering the lines. It was about proving you belonged. For years, Ernest Borgnine built his career on the big screen, but Hollywood was changing. By the early 1960s, television was becoming the new frontier, and studios were looking for actors who could transition from films to the small screen. Borgnine wanted nothing to do with it. To him, television was a step down, a medium for actors who couldn't make it in movies. He turned down offers without a second thought. Then, one encounter changed his perspective forever. At a charity event, he met a young boy battling a terminal illness. The child told him that watching his films had helped him get through some of his toughest days. Borgnine was stunned. He realized that entertainment wasn't just about prestige, it was about impact. If television meant reaching more people, making them smile, giving them something to look forward to, then maybe it was worth a shot. That realization led him to McHale's Navy. In 1962, he signed on to play Lieutenant Commander Quentin McHale, the leader of a misfit crew of sailors always getting into trouble. The show was nothing like his previous work. It was lighthearted, goofy, full of slapstick humor, the opposite of the tough, no-nonsense characters he had spent his career playing. But to his surprise, audiences loved it. Week after week, McHale's Navy climbed the ratings. Borgnine became a household name, not just as a serious actor, but as a comedic star. Fans stopped him on the street, quoting lines from the show, laughing at his antics. It was a completely different kind of fame, and for the first time, he understood the power of television. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. During the second season, a special effects mishap nearly ended his time on the show for good. A pyrotechnic device exploded too early, sending flames across the set. Borgnine was caught in the blast, suffering burns on his face and hands. Production had to shut down for 3 weeks while he recovered. When he returned, the pain was still there, but he refused to let it slow him down. He pushed through, finishing the season without missing another episode. After McHale's Navy ended in 1966, Borgnine returned to films, but he never ruled out television again. He had learned his lesson. TV wasn't a step down, it was a different kind of success. And in the 1980s, he found himself back in the spotlight in one of the most action-packed shows of the decade. At 67 years old, most actors were looking for quiet, low-risk roles. Not Borgnine. In 1984, he joined the cast of Airwolf, a high-adrenaline action series about a futuristic military helicopter. He played Dominic Santini, a veteran pilot and mentor figure, but what made his role stand out was his insistence on doing his own stunts. Producers warned him this was dangerous work. The show featured real helicopters, intense flight sequences, and high-speed chases. But Borgnine wasn't interested in playing it safe. He wanted authenticity. He had spent years in the Navy, and if he was going to play a pilot, he wanted it to feel real. Then, disaster struck. During filming, a helicopter lost control and crashed just feet from where he was standing. The impact sent debris flying, and for a moment, everyone thought he had been caught in the wreckage. But when the dust settled, Borgnine was still on his feet, shaken, but unharmed. It was a close call, one that made even the toughest stunt coordinators nervous. But Borgnine refused to back down. He finished the series with the same energy he had when he started, proving once again that age meant nothing to him. By the late 1990s, most people assumed his career was winding down. He had done it all: film, television, action, comedy. There was nothing left to prove. But then, out of nowhere, he found himself taking on a role that would introduce him to an entirely new generation. It started with his grandson. The boy was a huge fan of a new animated show on Nickelodeon, SpongeBob SquarePants. He kept telling Borgnine that he should be on it, that he would be perfect for one of the characters. At first, Borgnine laughed it off. What did he know about cartoons? But one night, at a charity event, he casually mentioned it to a Nickelodeon executive. The next thing he knew, he was reading for the role of Mermaid Man. The character was a retired superhero, long past his prime but still eager to fight crime, even if his mind and body weren't quite what they used to be. It was funny, ridiculous, and completely different from anything he had ever done before, and audiences loved it. For 17 episodes, Borgnine voiced Mermaid Man, bringing life to the aging hero with his signature energy and charm. Kids who had never heard of Marty, McHale's Navy, or Airwolf suddenly knew his voice. He became a fan favorite, with kids yelling "Evil" at him in public, referencing his character's signature battle cry. Even in his 90s, he kept going. His final recording session for SpongeBob SquarePants happened just 2 weeks before his death in 2012. At 95 years old, he was still working, still making people laugh, still proving that no matter how much Hollywood changed, he would always find a way to fit in. Looking back, Borgnine often said that his biggest mistake had been underestimating television. He had once believed it was just a passing fad, something beneath serious actors, but in the end, it was television that kept his career alive, that connected him with new audiences, that gave him a second, third, and even fourth act. He had gone from Oscar-winning actor to TV star to beloved voice actor, reinventing himself at every turn. And through it all, one thing remained the same. He never stopped working. Because for Ernest Borgnine, acting wasn't just a job. It was his life. Ernest Borgnine's life was full of action, drama, and unforgettable performances. But his love life? That was an entirely different kind of adventure. Over the years, he walked down the aisle 5 times, each marriage telling its own story. Some ended in heartbreak, others in scandal, and one, against all odds, stood the test of time. Perhaps the most infamous chapter in his romantic history was his brief and disastrous marriage to Broadway legend Ethel Merman. On paper, it seemed like a match made in Hollywood heaven. 2 stars at the top of their game, larger-than-life personalities, and an undeniable chemistry. But off paper, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. They married in June of 1964, and from the moment they said, "I do," things spiraled out of control. Their honeymoon should have been a romantic getaway, a time to celebrate their new life together. Instead, it became a battlefield. The problem? Everywhere they went, fans swarmed Borgnine. People lined up for autographs, shook his hand, and ignored Merman completely. She was used to being the star, the center of attention. But on this trip, she was playing second fiddle, and she hated every second of it. Resentment built with each passing day, turning what should have been a dream vacation into a nightmare. By the time they reached Tokyo, the tension finally erupted into a full-blown argument. Witnesses recalled hearing raised voices echoing through the halls of their hotel. Then came the final straw. In a fit of rage, Merman took off her diamond and pearl wedding ring and hurled it into a koi pond. The message was clear. This marriage was over. Less than 5 weeks after becoming husband and wife, they were filing for divorce. Merman never spoke about the marriage again. In 1978, she released her autobiography, filled with stories of her legendary career and personal life. But when readers got to the chapter titled "My Marriage to Ernest Borgnine," they found something shocking, a completely blank page. No words, no explanation, just empty space. For Borgnine, that silence was louder than any argument they had ever had. Years later, he admitted that it stung. That blank page said more than anything she could have written, he reflected. It was a slap in the face. I'll never forget it. After the disaster with Merman, Borgnine continued his search for lasting love, but it wouldn't come easily. His 4th marriage, to Donna Rancourt, lasted longer, but eventually ended in divorce as well. By the early 1970s, it seemed like he was destined to be unlucky in love. Then, everything changed. In 1972, Borgnine attended a party in Las Vegas, and that's where he met Tova Tresnais, a Norwegian businesswoman with a sharp mind and an independent spirit. She knew exactly who he was, and she also knew his reputation. 5 marriages weren't exactly a selling point, but Borgnine was determined to win her over. And for once, charm alone wasn't enough. He had to prove himself. Tova was different from the women he had married before. She wasn't looking for fame or attention. She had ambitions of her own. She was an entrepreneur, building what would eventually become a multi-million-dollar beauty empire. And rather than feeling threatened by her success, Borgnine became her biggest cheerleader. They married in 1973, and against all expectations, their love endured. While Hollywood relationships were notorious for being short-lived, theirs only grew stronger. Tova was by his side through the highs and lows of his career, offering support, advice, and stability. Borgnine often joked that he had finally found the secret to a successful marriage. Just marry someone smarter than you. And for 40 years, they proved that love didn't have to be dramatic, chaotic, or fleeting. As Borgnine aged, Tova became his rock, helping him navigate the later years of his career with grace and humor. And when he passed away in 2012 at the age of 95, she was right there with him, holding his hand. For a man who had spent most of his life searching for love, he finally found the one that lasted. And in the end, that was the greatest role of his life. By the late 1970s, Ernest Borgnine had done it all: Oscars, television success, and blockbuster films. But nothing could have prepared him for Convoy, a film that should have been another notch in his belt. Instead, it became one of the most chaotic productions of his career. Directed by the notorious Sam Peckinpah, Convoy was supposed to be a high-octane action film about truckers taking on corrupt law enforcement. Borgnine was cast as Sheriff Lyle Wallace, a brutal, power-hungry antagonist. On paper, it was perfect. Borgnine thrived in tough roles. But behind the scenes, the real battle wasn't between the truckers and the law, it was between the cast and their own director. Peckinpah was a visionary, responsible for classics like The Wild Bunch, but he was also unpredictable. He drank heavily, used drugs openly, and had a reputation for pushing both actors and crews to their limits. From day one, it was clear this wouldn't be an ordinary shoot. Entire sequences were rewritten mid-scene. The script became irrelevant. One day, Borgnine would show up with lines memorized, only to find out they had been changed overnight. Some days, Peckinpah didn't even show up at all. Tensions boiled over when a critical action scene kept getting delayed. Peckinpah had disappeared, leaving the cast and crew standing around with no direction. Borgnine, known for his patience, finally lost his temper. He confronted Peckinpah, telling him straight to his face that he was wasting everyone's time. The director, barely able to focus, just smirked and walked away. Despite the madness, Borgnine held things together. He gave one of his most ruthless performances, embodying the sheriff with such intensity that some audiences found him terrifying. But the film itself suffered. Editing was rushed, entire subplots were cut, and the finished product felt like a shadow of what it could have been. Convoy made money at the box office, but behind the scenes, it was considered a disaster. That didn't bother Borgnine. He had survived worse. But what came next nearly ended his career. By the 1980s, Hollywood was changing. The industry was obsessed with younger stars, flashy action films, and bankable names. Studios that once fought to cast Borgnine were now passing him over. His agents told him he was too old, that he wasn't a box office draw anymore. For the first time in decades, the phone stopped ringing. To Borgnine, this wasn't just rejection, it was betrayal. He had spent years proving himself, working harder than actors half his age, Yet Hollywood was treating him like a relic. But if there was one thing Borgnine had never been, it was a quitter. Instead of sulking, he turned to television once again. He became a guest star on hit shows like The Love Boat and Murder, She Wrote, proving he still had the same screen presence that made him famous. He didn't care if it was a starring role or a one-episode guest spot. He just wanted to keep working. And then, just when it seemed like his time in Hollywood had run out, something completely unexpected happened. A new generation of fans discovered him, not through films, not through TV dramas, but through an animated series on Nickelodeon. It all started with SpongeBob SquarePants. Borgnine's grandson was obsessed with the show. He kept telling him, "Grandpa, you have to be on this." Borgnine brushed it off. What did he know about cartoons? But at a charity event, he mentioned it to a Nickelodeon executive. Within days, he was sitting in a recording booth, voicing a retired superhero named Mermaid Man. The role was ridiculous, over the top, and completely different from anything he had done before. But something unexpected happened. Kids loved him. Decades after his Oscar win, after playing hardened villains and military officers, he had become a pop culture icon for an entirely new audience. And the best part? He loved every second of it. In interviews, he laughed about how kids didn't recognize him from his movies, but they knew Mermaid Man. "I never thought kids would care who I was," he admitted, "but they love Mermaid Man more than anything else I've done." For Borgnine, it was proof that talent had no expiration date. Hollywood had tried to push him aside, but he refused to disappear. Through sheer determination, he reinvented himself over and over again. And in the end, his greatest triumph wasn't just surviving the industry, it was proving that he was never too old to be unforgettable. Ernest Borgnine's life wasn't just a career, it was a fight. He went from being overlooked to winning Hollywood's highest honor. He stood toe-to-toe with the toughest names in the industry, from Joan Crawford's Fury to Spencer Tracy's Mind Games, and he never backed down. He outlasted them all, working longer than most, proving that endurance mattered more than fame. Every time Hollywood tried to shut the door on him, he forced it back open. He wasn't the handsome leading man. He wasn't the smooth talker. But he was unforgettable. Whether he was Marty, McHale, or Mermaid Man, he poured everything into his roles, giving audiences something real. His story isn't just about success, it's about survival. In an industry that chews people up and spits them out, Borgnine refused to disappear. Because in the end, Hollywood didn't define Ernest Borgnine. He defined Hollywood. Through battles, betrayals, failures, and triumphs, he proved one thing. Greatness isn't about how you start. It's about how you refuse to quit.